Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload loads of different types of videos surrounding true crime, education and psychology related topics. And welcome back to True Crime Week. If you haven't watched any of my videos this week, I am uploading a different true crime video every single day this week. So for today's case, we're going to be discussing the mysterious death of a man named Dave BOCKS, and it's definitely a very strange case. But before I discuss this case, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I am simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research on certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, we shall just go ahead and get started discussing the case of Dave BOCKS. David Anthony BOCKS was born on the 4th of November in the year of 1944 in Richmond County in New York. At the time of his case taking place in 1984, Dave BOCKS was 39 years old and working in the area of Fernald in Hamilton County in Ohio. He had spent the prior few years working in the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center, which from 1953 had been used as a location primarily associated with processing uranium in order for them to be utilized and used in nuclear weapon machinery. And due to the nature of the operations in the plant, it had a history of scandals and accidents, as well as being a known major polluter in the local area. And so a lot of people, because of all this, didn't really have the best perception of the company, the plant. But for Dave and a lot of other employees, it had been a stable form of employment. He first started working in the plant in the year of 1981 when he was employed as a pipe fitter, and to his superiors and colleagues, he was hardworking and trustworthy. His day-to-day job saw Dave inspecting a lot of the equipment and machinery in the plant and carrying out any necessary maintenance, and all round he was in charge of making sure everything was safe to use and working correctly. One of the main tasks he would carry out would be to keep on top of the radiation levels in virtually all parts of the plant depending on where he was assigned that day, and he would be the first to know if there had been any increase in these levels. In the later years of his employment, he would work night shifts, and his patrol of the plant in the night shifts would be met by just a few other employees who were also working the same shift, in a vast comparison to the busy facilities in the daytime. On the 17th of June 1984, the night prior to his death, Dave had been headed into work at around 11 PM, travelling to the plant with his co-worker, a man named Harry Easterling. And this was a normal routine for the pair. They would meet in the car park of a local restaurant that was not far from where either of them lived, and then they would drive up to the plant together. And according to Harry, that evening had been no different from any other. The pair had talked about new things in their life, with Dave telling him that he had been planning a trip away with his children not too far in the future. When the pair had arrived at work, Harry said that things happened exactly the same as they did every other shift, like clockwork. Dave headed straight to the maintenance room, dropped off his bags at the shared storage space, and got straight to doing his checks of the facilities. The next known point in Dave's shift had been a few hours later, when one of his co-workers had been doing their rounds when they spotted Dave sitting in a pickup truck parked on the grounds. He'd been sat in the truck with one of the supervisors in the plant, and the pair had apparently seemed as though they were in a tense or serious conversation. He hadn't been close enough to the truck to be able to hear what they were actually talking about, but he said it did seem very serious. He'd apparently found it notably strange that neither of the pair had rolled the windows down even a crack, as it was extremely muggy and a very hot summer night. And the worker had continued his rounds after noting the sighting, and then around an hour later he bumped into Dave again. He hadn't been expecting to see him at this point in the shift, as Dave had been in a completely wrong part of the plant. He'd been found in section 4 of the facility, although his shift for the night had been assigned to section 8 only. He hadn't noticed anything weird about Dave other than the fact that he was in a different area of the plant to where he should have been, but he put it down to possibly being asked to do an additional task for a supervisor. However, this was the last known sighting of Dave BOCKS alive. In the early hours of the next morning, towards the end of the night shift, a safety meeting was scheduled to take place in the section 4 conference room for all necessary employees. When Dave had failed to turn up for the meeting, Harry Easterling had noticed and thought that it was rather unusual of him, and so he decided to go and check in the maintenance storage room where Dave had placed all of his things that evening before when they'd first started their shift. All of his items were neatly arranged around the room just as he'd left them. He'd spotted Dave's keys in a toolbox in that storage room, and he'd assumed that this had meant that Dave was still in the building and maybe he decided to work some extra hours past the end of his night shift, and this wasn't an unusual or concerning occurrence, and so Harry had continued on without worry. According to some sources that I read, Harry had allegedly also witnessed a supervisor putting a lock on the toolbox with the keys inside, and as Harry had left the facility, he'd caught up with a security guard that was posted on the building where the maintenance room was located, and he'd asked him to remind Dave to meet him at the restaurant where they would usually meet before starting their night shift later on that evening. At 7:30 a.m, a lot of the usual day shift workers had started their shifts, and one worker in particular noticed something unusual. He'd been assigned to section 4 working on the furnace, and he called out to his supervisor to report that some of the furnace equipment was coated in an unusual sticky substance. It hadn't been an overly concerning finding, and upon assuming there would be some normal explanation for the finding, the supervisor had initially dismissed it. Nothing else particularly unusual occurred until later that night when Harry Easterling had turned up at the restaurant car park where he was supposed to meet Dave before heading to work. But Dave didn't show, and this is when Harry became extremely concerned. He headed to work alone and reported Dave as being missing to the security team at the facility, as well as telling him everything that he'd noticed in the prior shift. The security employees had begun investigating immediately and started searching the facilities for any indication of what could have happened, whether he was still in the plant or whether he did leave. And they noticed that at around 5:15 a.m. earlier that day, an anomaly had been reported as having occurred in one of the furnaces in the facility. A report of an anomaly could mean a number of things, but in this case the alert had been to state that a foreign item had entered the furnace. The security team had followed up on this report and began to search this furnace, which is where they found a piece of bone on the edge of the furnace. They had immediately become concerned and reported the finding to the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department, following which all operations in the plant were ordered to stop. Despite everything in the plant coming to a halt, investigators weren't actually able to carry out a thorough search of the furnace until everything inside had cooled down completely, and this would take a couple days. And in those days, investigators could do nothing but wait and hope that the heat of the furnace would not destroy all of the potential evidence inside. Once they'd finally been able to search the furnace, they found a number of things, including what was left of a set of human bones, a pair of glasses, a walkie-talkie, steel caps from workman boots, and a steel wire wound into circles. But an even more concerning finding in the furnace had been Dave's keys. The necessary tests were carried out and investigators confirmed the worst, that the remains had been of Dave BOCKS. The walkie-talkie was confirmed to have been the one assigned to Dave for his shift the prior evening, as well as the glasses and the steel caps having been belonged to him as well. The reason why the discovery of Dave's keys in the furnace had been so concerning was related to the report that Harry had given earlier on in the previous shift. The fact that he had seen Dave's keys in his toolbox after he'd already started to be concerned that he was missing. If Harry had in fact seen Dave's keys, it would beg the question of how they ended up in the furnace after it was believed that Dave had died. To investigators, there were two potential scenarios that could have led to Dave's death. He'd ended up in the furnace as an accident, or it was the result of foul play. And unfortunately, once finding the keys inside the furnace, it suggested that maybe someone had thrown them in there after causing Dave's death. In contrast though, there had been facts that pointed investigators towards a scenario of it being the result of a suicide. Allegedly, it had been suggested that Dave had been struggling with a number of different mental health conditions, in particular following the divorce to his ex-wife. It had been reported by someone that knew Dave that he had attempted to take his own life around this time, but this scenario had been argued strongly by Dave's family, who had been adamant that Dave would not have taken his own life and left his children. Instead, they were convinced that he had been murdered, and according to the reports of a number of Dave's colleagues, they all agreed too that this was the likeliest scenario. There had been a number of speculated theories revolving around what could have happened to Dave BOCKS, especially since there was a lack of information that investigators could collect from what was left in the furnace. One of the most suggested theories that I could find had been possibly that Dave had unearthed some unsettling information regarding the plant workings, or even the negative impact it was having on the environment because the products of what they were doing in the plant, since there was constant toxic and radioactive materials being released. So if Dave had come across some hidden byproducts of the plant's operations and discovered them to be harmful or hazardous, unconscious and then threatened to reveal this information, it could have been the reason for someone to have wanted to kill him. One investigator in particular had stated that the area in which Dave had been assigned to work that night, which was section 8, had been the area of the plant in which the largest traces of contaminants were released into the water supply in the facility. He suggested that if he had discovered that there were concerning amounts of hazardous waste being produced, that he may have attempted to threaten and release the information. He theorised that when he'd threatened to leak this information, someone had attacked him in section 8, where he was then rendered unconscious and transported to section 6, where he was thrown into a furnace. To my knowledge, I believe that investigators had listed Dave BOCKS' death as a suicide, but to this day there are so many questions people have regarding what had happened to him or whether or not someone else had some hand to play in this case. So I'd be definitely interested in hearing your guys' thoughts on this case down below. I do think that it is an entirely likely scenario that he had discovered something that was being produced by the operations in the plant, some sort of hazardous material or something that they shouldn't have been releasing that they were, and he had threatened the wrong person to release this information and something had happened to him. But yeah, I'd love to know your guys' thoughts down below. But that is where I'm going to end today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for another installment of True Crime Week. Thanks for watching. Bye.